If you could give me some requirements that define being Jewish, because we know there are all kinds of Jews. There are even some Jews who perceive themselves as atheists or agnostics. So what requirements does a person need to have in order to truly say that they have that Jewish identity?
One of the most difficult questions, not just today or yesterday, but for the past centuries, even in the Talmud, which is over 1,000 years old, there is debate about how we can define what it means to be Jewish. In the Middle Ages, for example, during the 14th century, they wondered if being Jewish is about how you are perceived from the outside, because maybe a Jew is someone who is perceived as Jewish, meaning it's independent of the person themselves, or if being Jewish is a matter of self-perception. As you are saying, there are people who perceive themselves as Jewish, but the definition itself being very complicated, what there actually are, as you said, are requirements. And the requirements for a person to be Jewish are that their mother is Jewish. If the individual was born to a Jewish mother, they are considered Jewish. And this is for historical reasons, because in ancient times, we didn't have DNA tests. You couldn't determine who a child's father was, but what you could determine with certainty is who a baby's mother was. So the mother is the determining factor when this, let's say, lineage is passed on to the next generation, and that's why the mother is the one we know for sure transmits Judaism. Another way a person can also be Jewish is through what is known as conversion to Judaism, and this is where the trick comes in. Many people perceive it in modern times in a way that historically hasn't been the case, but rather it's a historical distortion. Starting from the 18th century onward, Judaism has been perceived as a religion. However, the Jew is a people, and you yourself pointed out that there are Jews who are agnostic, there are Jews who are atheists. It wouldn't make any sense at all for a person who doesn't believe at all in religious factors to still be part of a religious category. It can't be. Therefore, atheist Jews are still Jews because Jews are a people and Judaism is the essence that accompanies them. This, let's say, framework or this essence that accompanies the Jewish people throughout the generations, whether in a dynamic or static way, however we want to see it. But a Jew is someone who is part of a nation. Therefore, the other way of being Jewish is when a person who was not Jewish, who was not born to a Jewish mother, or does not have that certainty, joins the Jewish people. To join the Jewish people, there is what's called the conversion process, but the term from conventional classical Jewish sources, the Talmud, etc., is that he is a foreigner. Gir means foreigner, and Gior is, roughly speaking, the act of joining the people of Israel. He becomes part of the people of Israel, he becomes part of the nation. And to be part of the nation, of course, he has to go through a series of requirements to align with the expectations of the nation, which is to accept the Torah, etc. So those are the two ways. Actually, there's a third option, more of a side note, called Eved. Kenani, which is the Canaanite slave, is one of the cases in the Talmud. It's full of cases that are unfamiliar to us today. But if you have a Canaanite slave and you free him, he becomes Jewish. I'm not going to get into that too much because it's almost irrelevant nowadays. But those are the first two ways I mentioned, which are the requirements for a person to be considered Jewish.
Well, let's suppose we're already talking about Jews, let's say either by genetics or through conversion. I was actually asking you more about those requirements that define the Jewish soul because I think there's a before and after. After October 7th, I mean, many people, we saw things differently before October 7th. Protests, for example, in Israel, many of them with Palestinian flags, where even many Jewish media outlets normalized it. I had some discussions even with some people about those topics. But after October 7th, I feel that there are many people who had a certain narrative, and somehow, I don't know if they covered it up, hid it, silenced it, and you didn't see Palestinian flags anymore, and it's like everything became more orderly. But there were Jews, even genetically 100%, with whom I also had some clashes, even those who talked, for example, about the occupation here in Israel. So when we talk about being Jewish, it doesn't matter what those Jews' views are on things, whether it's political or geopolitical, to define that being Jewish as...
That's a great question. I'll be honest with you. I'll speak to you first from, I am also a chemical engineer besides being a rabbi. John, I disagree that we should base ourselves on genetic factors, as you mentioned the term a couple of times, which is for the audience, Judaism, Jews, we are not a race, we are a people. And because we are a people, that's why there are Jews with many genetic variations. There are Jews of all colors, from all cultures where we've been, from all the nations where we've been scattered. Wherever you go, you'll find a Jew. That's why we come in all shades, as you can see in this podcast. But can a Jew have a different idea from another and still be a Jew? The answer, whether it hurts me or not, or whether it hurts us or not, I'll explain why it doesn't hurt me, is yes. There are Jews who disagree, like, for example, the Jew you mentioned, the case of the agnostic Jew or the atheist Jew. For a believing Jew, it might hurt that there is an atheist Jew, but an atheist Jew does exist. There is a Jew who supports a self-destructive cause, self-destructive like the Palestinianist cause, and in parentheses, not to be confused with the Palestinian cause. I'm talking about the Palestinianist movement, which is this whole narrative that doesn't so much seek to support the Palestinians, but rather the destruction of Israel. That's how I see it and interpret it, and there are Jews who support that cause. Just like during the Inquisition, there were Jews who decided to leave their faith and were still Jews because they had a Jewish mother. But are they willing to accuse their Jewish neighbor before the Inquisition so that he would be tortured and win the favor of Spanish society at that time? It also existed during the Holocaust, the Kapos. It also existed in the time of the Second Temple. It has existed throughout history, and today it is nothing new. In fact, during Hanukkah, we commemorate, it's one of the Jewish holidays called Hanukkah, that when there was a dispute precisely between the Jews who were more Hellenized versus the Jews who ultimately triumphed against Hellenism, and we are the descendants of those who won the struggle against Hellenism. That is to say, these disputes have always existed, so no, it doesn't really bother me much because the course of history, in the end, as an Orthodox Jew, I believe is determined by God. I do believe, on the other hand, that even though I understand they are Jews, we also have to understand that just because they are Jews, not everything is permissible, right? That is to say, also as an Orthodox Jew, one must set their limits. However, my view on this topic, and I know you didn't ask me this, but I believe that the role of the Jewish people, in a broader sense, is that we also have a universal role. Up until now, for the past 2000 years, we have focused on our spiritual role, and we have been great scholars from the texts of Jewish jurisprudence, from the Midrashim, from Jewish homiletics, from all the, let's say, theological or spiritual aspects. Since the creation of the State of Israel, we have also been able to take care of our national aspect. We have been able to take care of the revival of the language, our army, our land, our institutions as a nation, which is the State of Israel. But there is a part missing, a component that is essential in the role of the people of Israel. And this, anyone who has read the Hebrew Bible knows the prophets talk about this again and again. And it is the universal role of the people of Israel, that we are a light unto the nations. That is to say, in the soul of the Jew or the Jewish people. And this is where I also wanted to mention, and that's where I was going. You were talking about what the Jewish soul is. It's very hard for me to speak in such abstract terms about a soul or a spirit, since I don't know how to define such things, because my approach is a bit more naturalistic. But if there is a soul, a Jewish national spiritual unity, I think it has three components: the spiritual, the national, but also the universal. And we see how there are Jews from our nation who say, for example, the ultra-Orthodox, let's call them that they reject the national part and they don't join the Israeli army, for example. I am a soldier, by the way, also a reservist. I have fought in this war for about 340 days from October 7th until now in special forces, etc. But there are Jews who are also believers like me in the Torah, and they are Orthodox and they have their beards and all that, but they reject the national part. Why? Because they tend to be more spiritual. I lean toward both the spiritual and national sides. Some people, though, only lean national and aren't as spiritual. Some Jews have an essence that leans toward universality. And I think those are the kind of Jews. They are the ones who say, no, Palestinians also have rights. Palestinians are also people. And all of this, let's say, we often see it as a blow, a betrayal of Judaism, because they are willing to, let's say, trample on what happened on October 7, which was a horrible massacre. But I would also like to make a point that our role also begins there. We also have a role before the nations of the world. And as for me, yes, I am quite nationalist. And even so, I am aware that we also need to understand where the message from these Jewish brothers, who, in my opinion, are very lost, is really coming from. In my opinion, it's a case that's in very bad shape. but there's also a message that can be taken from there, and we can learn that we have a universal role. We also have to take the nations into account.
Yes, well, in that sense, that universal role you mentioned, I think more than anything, or at least the way I see it, is that it's aimed at those Arabs, for example, who live in Israel and want to live in peace with us, who deep down do not advocate for Islamic jihad, as has been seen in many cases. And those Arabs, well, they live in peace with us and we can accept them and we can live well with them. And the rest, it's more difficult anyway, I think. And well, in that same sense, I wanted to ask you now that Ben Gvir has been a bit controversial, especially because of the flotilla that came and the video that's been circulating. It's said that figures like Ben Gvir and Smotrich would create a kind of theocratic government, and that's even what the Jewish press is saying. Before October 7th, people were talking in those terms. How do we explain to people that this is not a theocratic government? How do we explain to people the idea that Israel can't become a secular country like any other? Because the truth is that many times we believe that the establishment or the deep state, the Israeli left, as it's also called, kind of wants that. Maybe that this country could be just like any other, like any secular country, let's say, where there's a separation between religion and the state. And in this case, that concept doesn't apply, let's say. How can we explain from our perspective that this isn't viable?
Okay, look, there's an article written by one of the most famous researchers of the last century, whose name was Gershom Scholem, that he wrote. One of the articles really, and Gershom Scholem, it's not that he was religious or anything, but he writes that in the Hebrew language there's a time bomb. Why? Because the founders of the Zionist movement, who were secular, and many of them were not just secular, they were anti-religious, and they intended to revive a country, a Jewish nation, based on an ancient Hebrew ethos, which is the Torah, the Tanakh texts, let's say the language itself, which comes from our oldest sources, which is the library I have behind me. And to pretend that the nation will remain secular, for Gershom Scholem, he analyzes this and says, that's naive. After a certain amount of time, the language itself will have to awaken, and the sources awaken. He calls them sources. And this Bible that had been kept as liturgical the moment you put it on the national level, is there some kind of synthesis? From there, obviously, there will be a feeling attached to religious factors, no matter how much the founders of the Zionist movement were secular, no matter how secular they are. And the truth is that we are living in that kind of transition. I don't think Israel can become a theocracy because we are a nation that has had historical experiences that do not allow us to go to those extremes. That is to say, Israel, we are going in a direction that I think is generally very clear. And it's like a pendulum, the way I see it. It's like the Hegelian discourse. Hegel was a philosopher who talked about how the world moves forward. When there are ideas that clash with each other, thesis, synthesis, so the thesis is that the state should be secular, the antithesis is no, that it should be a religious state, and these ideas clash, ultimately the synthesis is a compromise. There are sources in Judaism that lean toward the idea that you can have a completely religious state, but based on democracy. For example, that's the opinion of Ran. Ran was a Jewish sage from the Middle Ages who proposed such a thing. In modern times, there are rabbis who propose such a thing. Isn't there a contradiction between a democratic state and a state based on having a Sanhedrin? Yes, obviously, there are certain nuances that need to be analyzed. In the case of Ben Gvir, obviously, he is very populist. I agree with some things he says and disagree with others, but I think it's a big exaggeration because people fear reaching that point and society doesn't want it to happen. It won't occur. I think people don't need to panic so much just because there's a cabinet member making noise, right? I think Israeli society, we're not going to go that far. That's the first point. Another point I wanted to touch on is the first thing you mentioned about living with Muslims and all that. It's true. In Israel, 23% of the population are Arabs, among them Muslims, Christians, and there's another group who are Russians, and so on, and they live in peace. In fact, in the army, I was with Arabs, in the army fighting alongside me Muslims. That's what the world doesn't understand, that Israel is far from being the demonized image they paint. But the reality is that there are nearly 2 billion with a B Arabs in the world, Muslims, sorry, in the world, even if 10 or even just 3% are radicals, that's a lot. We're talking about millions of people. And it's them that Israel, we have to be very, let's say, honest, because Israel is the thorn in the side of Islamic ideology. They want a homogeneous global expansionism. They really do want an indisputable theocracy. And we, Israel, are that thorn in their side. So I think that here it became clear that Israel has a role among the nations. Because the only way to defeat radicalism or to defeat an ideology, I don't think it's with tanks or with planes or with exploding vipers. The only way to destroy an ideology is if you offer a better ideology. And that's precisely the vision, let's say, of Orthodox Judaism, that Judaism, by wanting to be a light unto the nations, it's because we have a plan for the nations that surpasses the expectations of other ideologies like jihadism. So, for example, in Judaism, there is something called the Noahide laws, which is a system of, let's say, Judaism for non-Jews. I think that if jihadists knew more in depth about the depth of Judaism, the Noahide laws, they could evaluate whether it's worth continuing to be a jihadist or if maybe the path for Noahide is it's not necessary to explain the Noahide laws in great detail. On my YouTube channel, Jewish Philosophy, I talk a lot about that, but maybe the average jihadist would evaluate and say, well, it seems like this ideology is much better. And so the world, once again, thesis, antithesis, the Hegelian concept he brings. In fact, I mentioned Hegel to modernize it for the viewers, but he said that Rav Kook, there's a picture of him I have somewhere. He was Israel's main spiritual leader in the early 20th century. And that's the idea. So also with the radicals, we need to have this approach, well, c'est pas possible. Approximation. But
Approximation.
approximation. We have a message for them, but obviously, if someone comes with a sword, we can't just give them kisses and hugs. We will also respond with the sword. We will protect ourselves. And we will not be a theocratic state. I think that Ben Gvir, Smotrich, no, they're not the big drama they're being made out to be. I actually think it's much more dangerous. In fact, the Israeli left-wing parties that are willing to give up Israeli territory in exchange for supposed peace, like what happened in Gaza, they gave up the border, they gave up the Gaza Strip, and what we got was a colossal war throughout the entire Middle East. Why? Because by giving up Israeli territory. So I think it's more dangerous for the region, a left-wing ideology that weakens Israel. Because a strong Israel means peace in the region. We see it. A strong Israel means a calm Saudi Arabia, a cold Iran, an Iran that, even though it's developing under the radar, at least keeps its head down. And so a weakened Israel equals a Middle East in chaos. That's why I think the other side of the coin is much more dangerous.
I wanted to ask you regarding this deep state or establishment that we have. There are some pillars, you could say, where this secularization of what Israel is based. One of them is, well, academia or the academic world, right? Even though nowadays many Israeli academics are having serious problems working together with other foreign academics just because they are Israeli, I, as a journalist, also see that the Israeli press is very left leaning. I mean, not all of them. There are a few, just a few outlets, let's say, but for the most part, the Israeli press is quite left leaning. For me, that's also one of the main pillars. And at some point, I wanted to do a project, and I found that I realized that our training as journalists makes it so that even many Jewish journalists operate with a lot of bias because of the very training that we have. So changing this internal system, let's say, is complex, extremely complex. The judicial branch is also another key point. Here in Israel, what would need to happen for Israel to move further toward that religious identity and for us to somehow overcome this establishment that we have today? EM.
I agree with you that major pillars of Israeli society tend more toward ideas. No, I don't know if they're left wing, but yes, many are left wing, although many are more centrist. But just as a side note, I think that very interesting. In that, that's very important that outside of Israel, when in reality it has become it's very important for an Israel. And that, no, not at all. This is what you just said. It's proof that there are people in Israel who are Zionists, who join the army, who support Israel. They just disagree on whether Israel should have a presence in certain areas of Judea and Samaria or what the economic model should be. But they are Zionists, and I say this because outside of Israel, there are also Jews who are Zionists, who are left wing, and who support Israel. The problem is when there are people who are left wing, and since they are not Jewish, they don't know the reality in Israel. They say, oh, since I'm, I don't know, a feminist, I have to be automatically anti-Zionist. That to me doesn't make any sense because in Israel there is a Zionist left. I also invite the viewer, if they're left wing, to consider whether it's possible to be left wing and support Israel. I think so, even though I'm not at all a supporter of many of the ideas, not all many left wing ideas. There are ideas on the left that I find commendable, and there are ideas that I don't. But the whole, let's say, more woke, progressive set of ideas seems absurd to me, and I think it's an insult to human intelligence. And I think those groups can also consider whether they can be Zionists, because I believe you can be a progressive and support Israel. I don't see a contradiction. I just mention it as a curious fact since there are no absolutes in the world. Now, about what should be done, I'm going to tell you about the case of Spain. I did a live broadcast about the topic of Eurovision. That Eurovision is a competition that maybe the Latin American audience knows less about, but in Europe, it's a big deal. It's a big thing. It's like the World Cup. Well, I exaggerated because the World Cup is also big. And many countries participate in a singing competition. Spain decided to withdraw from the Eurovision competition, which includes European countries and other non-European countries. And why did Spain withdraw? Because they said if Israel participates, we will not participate, as a boycott against Israel. So in Spain, the Spanish public television, which is state-owned, therefore follows the tendencies of Pedro Sanchez, who is from a very radical left. They didn't broadcast Eurovision. They didn't show it because of their boycott. Do you think the Spanish people watched Eurovision or not? Debora.
They probably did. They found a way to watch it.
Of course, exactly. That everyone watched it on YouTube. I did that live stream and I saw in the comments people saying, "Ah, Eurovision was great. I watched it on YouTube." In the case of Argentina, for example, the media was very much against the current president of Argentina, but like they were throwing so much dirt at him nonstop. But social media triumphed over all that, over all the anti-propaganda. That is to say, we are in a generation where the monopoly of the so-called media dictatorship is disappearing. All of this, where you had to depend on television, it's true that there are still millions of people who get their information from the box, the television on the wall, but there are many other millions, especially the younger generation. No, this device feeds them and is where they get their information. That's why now the new media war won't be about what an academic says in a tiny circle of the elite, or what the newspaper says, I don't know, something so prestigious that nobody reads it and they're going to stop printing it. So information won't come from there. Information will come from ordinary people, people like you, Deborah, who will dedicate themselves to it, who make it their profession, like in your case. They know how to get the information out. They know who to interview. They know how to present the narrative. They know how to put together a podcast. And people like you are the new revolution, which is still just getting started. In fact, the Arab world had a series of civil wars in the past decade, which they called it the Arab Spring. And how did the Arab Spring start? Through social networks, they started writing on what was called Twitter. They were tired of the dictators, and a series of civil wars broke out to overthrow the dictators in each country of the Arab world. In the end, it wasn't an Arab Spring, it was an Arab winter. Things went badly, they failed, but that only showed the power that this device has. So, is it true that there is this tiny elite with a very specific political tendency? In the end, the ones who are setting much of the narrative are the people who know that the media landscape is shifting from the formerly traditional media to the new media, which are social networks. So, I also don't think the situation is that hopeless for that very reason.
Well, I noticed that the government has carried out two important projects that have to do with this change, let's say this shift in focus. In a way, one is the creation of a communications department, which I imagine is in response to all the fake news we saw that affected us so much and that are still happening as well. Of course, also in the war now with Trump, who also gave a lot of visibility to that phenomenon, let's say. And on the other hand, I also noticed that they created, let's say, the position of a liaison with the world Christian, especially because of the large number of Christians who love Israel. Well, they fit in there. I don't know if they would call themselves Christians. For example, the Noahides, also Christians, for example, from the evangelical branch, who are in general people who are very fond of Israel. And I think that by working so much on communication, right, to fight against all these fake news, because the Palestinian narrative, as you say, is very malicious, very slanderous. But we also have this world that loves Israel, and that in some way they also make up a large number and can be great allies for us in this crusade. Do you think that we will really be able to finally change this paradigm? I mean, will we really be able to end up with an Israel with a strong Jewish identity? What needs to happen for us to be able to move forward, let's say, to the other side of what existed before this October 7th, 2023?
That is one of the questions that I have also asked great speakers about what is called clarification. Yes, what is called Hasbara, as they say in Hebrew. Yes, Hasbara, or the clarification of what the Israeli conflict is and all that. Should it be directed outward or should it be among Jews, for example? When you send a message, should it be precisely so that we have a clear identity? Because victory comes if we are strong. That is one of the perspectives. Another perspective is no, you also have to fight. I think both are correct, but here I was having a conversation. She was the vice president, the deputy vice minister of the municipality of Jerusalem, or deputy mayor, sorry, of Jerusalem. Her name is Flor. And she was telling me that there should be some kind of Sahal, that is a defense force like the one we have in Israel. We are very strong in the military field. We have technology, tanks, planes, and special forces soldiers, and the Mossad and all that on the battlefield. But on the battlefield that you present, which is the media battlefield, we Jews can give ourselves the excuse that we've always lost the media war since memorable times. They've always said that Jews have horns and a tail, that we created the Black Plague, and that we killed God, so we've lost the battle. From the start, that's one perspective. On the other hand, Flo used to tell me, no, look, Jews are also very good at telling stories. For example, Jews created Hollywood, Jews created what we now see as the Western perspective of what it means to be successful and what it means to have aspirations. And all of that is a Jewish invention. Jews created the American ethos through Hollywood. Jews are good at inventing stories, or not inventing, but explaining stories, explaining ideas. That's something we have from, well, all of the Midrash is based on knowing how to explain ideas in a much more didactic way. We can do it, but it has to be done in an organized way, that's for sure. I think that if some kind of Israeli defense forces were created, but in the media, I mean, with a commander, if you're in the army, you have a battalion commander, a platoon commander, a team commander, you have someone in charge of logistics, and do that, copy and paste it into the world of media interaction. I think we can succeed, just like we're very good at doing everything because I don't know how to say it to show off. But we Jews are very good at doing what we want to do. So I think we would be very successful if we did it. We just have to do it. That's the problem. And for now, Israel, up until now, since all the events of October 7th, it just woke up from a 20-year slumber. They were 20 years behind. They took the issue of narratives lightly, and oops, they woke up. With pro-Iran bot farms in China, and everywhere you look, they're commenting. They're bots, literally. You can check user by user. They're bots commenting, free Palestine, Jews, I don't know what else. But Israel, we must fight back. I don't see any problem with us making counterbots to counteract that and make it much more. I mean, it's a battlefield. I don't see it as anything less than a battlefield. And I think that would be a way to start shifting the narrative.
Yes, well, they've already announced that they created that department. I don't know if it's a ministry or a communications department specifically to fight that battle you're talking about. I would like to be, sorry, a bit more informed. What do they intend to do? What is the strategy? What do they plan to implement? Because for me, as a journalist, of course, I'm very interested and I would love, for example, to be part of that project. For example, I applied because of my degrees. I applied at one point for a diplomatic position a couple of years ago or 3 years ago, but a part of it comes from birth. In Chile, they call it civil service. I don't remember what they call it here, which is through the senior public management. And I made it to the second stage, but there was a part of the exams. In English, I had no problem, but in Hebrew, since my Hebrew still isn't very good, I got stuck there. The Hebrew part, it had a time limit. So I said, well, I have to find a way to use my expertise and my career to return to my profession in Israel because that's what I love and that's where I am now. It's still been hard for me because I feel like I haven't found that team, that place yet. But anyway, I think that this other idea they created of working with all the people who love Israel, it's also a really good idea. It doesn't matter if they're Jewish, because personally, I think that Hasbara, as you say, shouldn't be aimed only at Jews. I mean, no, we don't have to preach to the choir. What I think is much more effective, and also, since we're telling the truth, it's about delivering that message, like you said, that we are a light among the nations. We have to deliver that message in a universal way and work with all those people who love Israel so that they can, let's say, help convey and amplify that Hasbara. That's how I see Hasbara. I don't know what you think.
Yes, as I mentioned to you, I think it should be on both frequencies. Also, it's up to us to make it very clear. Sometimes you see the story they air on the BBC that Israel did such a thing, and there's doubt in the heart of the Jew, are we doing the right thing? And yes, yes, we are doing the right thing. So BBC reported fake news. So I think it should also be for us, and if we are strong, I believe we will succeed. In the end, the fathers of Israel said it. David Ben Gurion said, it's not what the nations say, but what the Jews do. So I think the strength truly lies in our unity, in our ability. From Deborah Bechan, thank you for the invitation. I hope it comes true. What you say, that we should be that projection, we have the truth. As you say, I have no doubt that we are the ones who tell the truth time and time again, which has been proven, and that's why I believe we will succeed. And well, to the Jews, both those who practice and those who practice less, well, I also invite them to stand in defense of Israel in these historic moments.
Thank you very much for your interview. A hug.